guess I have a comment and a question. And my comment is that it seems to me that you need to test this developmentally, because it should be the case that developmental events have an impact on personality. And so I guess a follow-up from that would be, what's your take on the stability of personality across the lifespan? Because there is evidence that personality is stable across the lifespan. And yet, you know, I mean, I suppose that attractiveness might also, and strength might also be stable across the lifespan, but it seems to me that a little kid's attractiveness and strength is going to be quite different from their attractiveness and strength when they go through puberty and beyond.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think the evidence about the longitudinal stability of personality, I mean, there are moderate correlations across the life course, but I mean, I think the big take home there is that there's a significant amount of change as well. I mean, there are a variety of issues. When it comes to very early childhood temperament predicting later personality, the results are really, you know, very consistent with Karthik and Willem's models, where only kids at the extremes of temperament, right, say in the top, you know, 5th percentile and bottom 5th percentile, have temperaments that end up predicting their personality, say 5 years later, suggesting that they may have experienced very reliable cues early on that canalize them toward a particular developmental trajectory. And I think across the life course, personality is usually going to maintain a good amount of recalibratability, right? So personality should be able to be recalibrated on the basis of different input cues, right? You take someone, you pluck them out of Los Angeles, where everyone's pretty attractive, and put them pretty much anywhere else in the country, right? Over some period of time, they might find that they went from the 45th percentile in attractiveness to the 90th percentile in attractiveness. And so over some period of time, I would predict you would see a recalibration of their personality accordingly as their sort of relative bargaining power in their local community has increased.
Do you agree that that's a crucial prediction?
Crucial.
Remains to be tested?
Yes, indeed. Sure, yes.
And along the same lines, I would say that socioeconomic status predicts bargaining power to a certain extent. So if a person moves from one social context to another where they have a different relative socioeconomic status, their bargaining power and their personality should calibrate to their bargaining status.
Yes, to the extent that socioeconomic status is really represented by the mind in the modern world as having a lot of bargaining power in the way that the mechanism is designed to compute it, then yes, I completely agree with you. But yeah, I think that one problem, you know, in this research generally, is that people's assessments of their own bargaining power is going to be based on some circumscribed, you know, social group of people that they hang out with regularly, right? So the fact that I have higher bargaining power, you know, socioeconomically than someone I never interact with and don't even really know exists, who, you know, lives 20 miles away in Los Angeles, I'm not sure if that's how the mechanism should be designed to operate. But
what I'm saying is to plot a person from one group to another, or from one country to another, speaking from personal experience.
Sure.
Their bargaining power in different social settings may change.
Sure.
And the cues you get from the people you interact with determine your own assessment of your bargaining power, and then that may reflect itself in all that list of personality traits that you have.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm currently organizing a group of researchers internationally to test some cross-cultural hypotheses consistent with what you're saying. In fact, if anyone's interested in doing some data collection, let me know. Yeah, the basic idea being that to the extent that there are cultural differences in what determines bargaining power, right, or at least differences in the weightings, right? In some places, formidability might be really important. In other places, it might be next to irrelevant. You know, things like certain aspects of intelligence or something like that might be really important in some places and not other places, right? So self-evaluation of bargaining power should track those culturally specific weightings as well, in sort of an evoked cultural manner. But anyway, so.
And also within the same society, between different social segments of the same society.
Yes, absolutely.
Follow up on that. Aaron's point about the development. I don't know if you have the data within studies, but if you know something about the developmental environment in which these different groups went to, you can test that, because if they went to similar, if they were adopting the similar socioeconomic definition, you should get one heritability, or, yeah, and then if they have different, you should get less, and you could use many studies if they already have that. And if you get adopted into a place where better looking people or stronger,
Right.
you might be able to, I don't know if the data, depends if they really have that kind of data.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's done the work of doing cross-cultural differences in attractiveness.
Well, not cross-cultural, just if you know something about the developmental environments of where the things went, you could use that to moderate the variability.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just saying I'm not sure if we know where people are more or less attractive. I mean, we know intuitively, but I'm not sure if empirically. But yes, absolutely, and I think that's important. Yes.
I understand your model. It's all from the characteristics of attractiveness and strength to extroversion. None of it the other way. Imagine a population of genetically identical individuals where randomly some do well in their early fistfights and social interactions and others do badly.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to drive some people to be extroverts and some to be introverts. Not at all hard to believe that the introversion and the neuroticism is going to show up in your face. It's going to show up in attractiveness. It's going to show up in your level of physical activity. So why can't we get most of this way with Skinner before we even get to genetic?
Well, I agree with you that, I mean, essentially the take-home is that measuring people's genotypes is not going to get you very far at all, right? Because there aren't these personality genes that have long been envisioned, right? So absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, there's a broader discussion about whether, learning can happen without any sort of specialized mechanisms,
We know with respect to specific skills that somebody who happens to pick up the violin may get interested in the violin and then get good at it and then get rewarded for it and suddenly be a violin player, right? And the identical person exposed to the viola instead would become a violist.
Sure.
And we've got hockey, right? We know that being born in January is very good for hockey playing. So.
Sure. I think it's an open question as to exactly how, if there is an internal regulatory variable in the mind that estimates your relative bargaining power, right? It's actually possible that it doesn't know anything about your actual phenotypic characteristics and entirely just operates on social feedback, right? Am I getting sort of reinforced in a sense for behaving in this way? If so, I must have high bargaining power.
Why should we think of that as an optimizing mechanism measuring bargaining power rather than merely reinforcement action?
I think I have an empirical solution to Mark's conundrum, which is, given the population that you've examined so far, Mark's explanation strikes me as a strong competing explanation, where differences in physical strength, for example, probably are a consequence of differences in physical activity, and in a population that's zoo-kept the way we are, that pretty much means athletic activity. But that's not true for most humans for most of human history, and it's not true for most humans today. So if you go to a subsistence level society, differences in physical strength are not a consequence of individuals' choices in the recreational activities they pursue or something like that. If the correlations still hold, then your explanation is defeated. If they don't, then your explanation stands.
Sure, and I believe that that Mike Girvin and colleagues have found similar results among the Timane. Certainly finding that physical strength in men predicts social status and associated personality characteristics. And I don't believe they're known for hitting the gym and actively trying to increase their formidability and attractiveness. But certainly I do think that there would be, people often ask if there would be reciprocal relationships, right? So even if it's largely the case that, say, extraversion is being calibrated to physical strength, right, it might also be the case that extroverts are more inclined to, enhance their physical strength in various ways. And I certainly think that there could be, developmentally reciprocal relationships there. So I'm not sure if that's relevant as well. Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this scale for bargaining power, because I think about bargaining power as being really multifaceted, right? So there are some aspects of bargaining power that may be more tightly linked to physical attractiveness or relative strength or something like that. Whereas, I mean, but I think of humans as being pretty specialized even within small-scale societies. So the same guy who may have a lot of bargaining power in determining whether a group should go to war or pick a fight with the neighboring group may not be the guy who has a lot of bargaining power in terms of deciding how, when they should move to the next water hole or something like that. So, I mean, I imagine that this scale was probably designed. I'm a little bit concerned, I guess, actually, that even the questions in this scale that you're using might be pretty similar to the outcomes that you're trying to measure, which might give you the high correlation coefficients that you're getting, right? So something like level of social support. So if you're asking them a question about, how much support do you think you can get compared to other people, and then the outcome is perceived level of social support, your predictor and your outcome are essentially measuring the same thing.
Sure, that's a point well taken. I mean, I think for social support, it's more of a problem than certain other of the scales, which are how likely would you be to behave in a particular way, in a certain circumstance. In which case, I mean, there are always problems with self-report scales, just exhibiting correlations artifactually by virtue of method variance. But yeah, I mean, I do think there's a conceptual distinction in the purely evaluative way that the bargaining power scale is formatted versus the personality scales, which actually involve assessing your likelihood of behaving in certain ways and whatnot.
What kind of realms of bargaining power are being measured in the scale that you use?
It's pretty heterogeneous. I mean, things like rating yourself on incompetent versus competent, and also just sort of generally evaluative terms like inferior versus superior. It's not a particularly specific measure of bargaining power, but psychometrically, I think that's how the representation of one's own bargaining power really shows up, as in sort of a general sense of betterness, right? Self-esteem is even not exactly getting at the issue, right? Because self-esteem leaves open the possibility. It's a little bit of a touchy-feely type thing, right? Deep down, I'm a great person, right? But then, are you better than other people? Not really, Whereas, more sort of robustly evaluative scales say brass tacks. Here's other people, here's you, where do you stand? And everyone's responses to across a wide variety of domains are really highly intercorrelated. And I agree that it's likely much more context specific than that. But the fact that we do see correlations between at least sort of components of bargaining power that should actually determine the overall construct in a community-wide setting, right? Formidability and attractiveness and various abilities that predict your ability to deliver benefits to others broadly, right? That tends to be predictive of the broad measures of bargaining power. But I do need to develop better psychometric measures of bargaining power, and I've been hassled by reviewers about the same sorts of things. So.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, the way to solve the problem, it strikes me, is not to use psychometric measures at all. It's to use social measures, right? So to have a pool of participants, ideally, a village-level society is perfectly suited for this rather than university population, but you could do it in a dormitory or something like that, right? Where people rate one another, and right, so who makes decisions in this domain, whose opinion carries sway, who is deferred to, and so on, right? And now you can get a consensus evaluation from among the individuals who constitute the relevant social group.
Sure.
And so self-report is completely irrelevant.
I would say that from a design standpoint, what is relevant is self-report, and well, to the extent that self-report maps onto your internal representation, right? It's possible to be miscalibrated, right? If your bargaining power estimation system has gotten cues that lead it to believe that you have a higher level of bargaining power than you actually have, then that would produce the predicted effects on personality calibration as, say, a person who represents himself as being higher value than they actually are. So I mean, I think you have to show a correspondence, right? It has to be true to some extent.
There's a methodological issue about...
certainly there's a methodological issue.
Brooks' point is, when you give people general questions like, and I should point out, just as a piddly little detail, that superior, inferior is not symmetrical with competent, incompetent.
But yet they're intercorrelated at about 0.8.
I mean, that tells you something about a folk model of people's representations of psychological traits. It doesn't tell you what the underlying psychological mechanism is.
Absolutely.
You can, if you ask in, situations of physical conflict, who is the leader in the group? In situations of, collective decision-making, who is the leader in the group? Those are the kinds of, ecologically valid domains that, by your theory, the system ought to be operating in. And those are difficult things to ask people with regard to self-report. Okay?
Right.
Because there's a lot of impression management. So, for example, just looking at the correlations that you gave us on self-reported attractiveness are stronger with your bargaining power and so on, right, than on other reported attractiveness. And that's consistent with, well, if I'm an extrovert, I think I'm a great-looking person, right?
Sure.
And so I tell you, yeah, I'm a great-looking person. And that's the methodological problem that is intrinsic to self-report material. So I agree with you that theoretically there has to be an underlying mechanism that, given your theory, it ought to work that way. But methodologically, I think Brooke's right that self-report is not the strongest measure that you could use, and that there are alternatives that are better.
I completely agree with you that there are weaknesses associated with the methods. Well, 2 points. First is that there is evidence bearing on this, using round-robin ratings and in relation to in social groups in relation to self-reports of self-assessments of sociometric status and power and things like that. People are surprisingly accurate in estimating their own status within a group and their own kind of bargaining power, right? To the point that status researchers now are satisfied to just use self-reports of sociometric status in a group because going through this laborious round-robin rating process is really a high cost to pay for an additional, incremental validity of maybe 10% or something. So, so that's one point. And yeah, again, not dismissing the general concern, but just saying that there is some evidence to support the idea that people are accurate in representing these things. And really, it would be, functionally nonsensical to not be able to represent accurately your bargaining power and especially be able to communicate about it. I mean, yes, there can be biases that you can make predictions about, but if you should know about anything, it should be your own relative formidability and your own bargaining power and your own kind of status, right? Because there are high costs to misestimating those things, or even signaling that you're misestimating them, right?
But the trouble is that, a box that you check on a form is not a signal. And if you think that's a signal, then you're mistaking the measure for the ecology in which the measure is intended, in which the mechanism is intended to operate. Right? They're not the same thing. It doesn't cost me anything to say, yeah, I'm in the 90th percentile on fighting ability. It costs me nothing at all. What do I actually do when there's a bar fight? Well, that's maybe a different question. Sure.
Really interestingly, though, in that vein, those same round-robin studies of status ratings, it's the people who think they have higher status in the self-report measures than other people believe they have, who are disliked in the group and who are actually eliciting punitive sentiments from the other group members. So even if you're measuring something that can be easily faked or whatever, it does actually correspond to how people are signaling within the group as well, namely that they are too self-entitled given their actual bargaining power. But anyway, we can go on and on about this for days, and I would love to, but yes.
Regarding the covariation of distinct traits, it seems like the sort of chief alternative adaptationist models to address this question is the life history models, Figueiredo's model, where certain personality configurations are associated with a slow life history and the opposites for the fast life history. So my question is how your model relates to theirs. Are they competitors? Can you explain some of their results with your model? How might you line them up and contrast them to each other?
Sure, that's a good question. When it comes to life history theory, I think it has the potential. I think it might have been oversold as the answer to all individual difference questions. life history theory identifies some broad cost-benefit trade-off dimensions, and so consistent with cost-benefit trade-off theory to the extent that that makes predictions about the optimal sort of levels of various components of strategies, then yes, life history theory is useful. But I think there are lots of different cost-benefit trade-offs that are kind of missed by life history theory, at least in its current form, right? Current versus future reproduction and certain of these broad life history dimensions. There are also trade-offs between number and quality of relationships, right? And that doesn't really map on cleanly to any kind of life history framework, but yet it might be highly relevant in terms of calibrating your level of extraversion. So I think there are cost-benefit trade-offs that are missed by life history theory broadly that you can reason about more specifically. And also the Figueiredo type model and Marco del Guidice is also theorized in this regard, and Daniel Nettle. There's the idea that there might be coordinated strategies that are intrinsically interlinked, right? So I talked about a common calibration model where different traits are correlated because they're independently calibrated to common input cues, right? But an important assumption of that model is that those traits could, in fact, vary independently within individuals, right? That is, one individual could defy the overall trend and say have high levels of extraversion, but also high levels of attachment anxiety, even though those things are negatively correlated on average by virtue of common calibration. And that's what you expect when traits are calibrated in response to partially non-overlapping suites of input cues, right? So if let's say extraversion and attachment anxiety are both influenced by bargaining power, but they're also each calibrated in response to other cues, right, that aren't bargaining power, and those are non-overlapping, right? It then makes sense to have independent calibration of both trait dimensions so you can sort of maximize functional organization. But there might be some traits that have been subject to synergistic selection, where component strategies work well when implemented together, but not so well when broken apart, right? If you're going to pursue a gregarious social strategy where you coordinate with lots of different individuals, right, it might be sort of necessary to have a certain level of assertiveness that goes along with that. And to the extent that the success of a gregarious strategy is dependent on some level of assertiveness, selection might have acted to create intrinsic interlinkages among different components of strategies in order to constrain the extent to which they can vary independently, right? And that's probably a better explanation for what's happening, say, within the extraversion continuum. All the highly intercorrelated lower order facets might actually be part of a coordinated cluster of traits that are distinct but intrinsically interlinked as a function of a history of synergistic selection. I'm not sure if that fully came across. Does that broad distinction make sense? Right. So I think both of those types of explanations can be incorporated. Wherein, and they're also not mutually exclusive with respect to any particular set of traits, right? You can have intrinsic interlinkages can set a lower bound on the extent to which there's trait covariation, but then common calibration can further drive those patterns of covariation up or keep them at their sort of minimum level and pull them apart, depending on the socio-ecological cue structure and whatever else. Yes.
I think you do add a lot to personality theory with your calibration model. But in one of your early slides, in contrasting more adaptationist cost-benefit, you had and or, but the words that you used when you described the slide were only or, and you then proceeded to sort of dismiss the and I strongly believe in the and I think you do a disservice to what you've done by working too hard to try to dismiss the and, because I think there's lots of evidence for heritable variation. I mean, just for example, do you have access to any data sets where you could control physical attractiveness and physical strength and then still look for heritability of,
to my knowledge, those data don't exist. And there are people out there who are trying to develop it currently, but it's very indirect still. And I have my doubts about whether the methods are going to allow the proper assessment of formability or attractiveness. And I also have doubts about, in principle, the extent to which twin studies, unfortunately, by virtue of certain constraints, can actually test this hypothesis.
Now, your polymorphism, one would only expect it to account for a relatively small percentage of the variance. But in your data, if you control physical attractiveness and physical strength, do you still get the link between the polymorphism and extraversion?
Oh, that's a good question.
Report that?
Yes, in the paper, we report a mediation analysis where we show that the association between the androgen receptor gene polymorphism and extraversion is almost entirely mediated through men's physical strength. Right? So the polymorphism has a bigger effect on strength than on extraversion, and 2/3 of the variance of that gene personality linkage is explained through physical strength, which would make a lot of sense. I mean, that's potentially a direct illustration of reactive heritability, to the extent that what's really happening is extraversion is being calibrated to strength regardless of its genetic basis. And the androgen receptor gene polymorphism, at least in this sample, is predicting physical strength relatively robustly. But I should note that genome-wide association studies have failed to replicate both the androgen receptor gene effect on extraversion and also the effect on strength.
Well, I think GWAS studies have many problems. But,
they do as well.
But I don't think that they prove, I don't think the problems that they have prove that there are not underlying genetic influences, just not one single consistent thing. There are systems that influence personality, and there are many genes that influence systems in complicated ways.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that those, so, they found, for instance, that although no single nucleotide polymorphisms individually predict basically any personality traits, if you take all of them and put them in as simultaneous predictors, then they can explain maybe 6 or 7% of the variance in some personality traits like extraversion and neuroticism. But this is what is now being referred to as the infinitesimal model, where any given gene locus has such a tiny effect on a given phenotype as to be virtually immeasurable.
Right, but still, it's the theory-free aspect of GWAS that I think is really a fundamental problem.
I would certainly agree there.
Not using all the information that we know about brain structure, behavior structure,
Sure.
to increase the power of the
Well, I wonder what you think about, so the evolutionary genetic models posit specifically that selection pressures on personality variation are what are maintaining genetic polymorphisms that ultimately underlie the heritable variance in personality. Okay, so that's a very specific claim of these evolutionary genetic models, to the extent that they are to apply to personality variation. But the mathematical models and simulations show that you really have to have a relatively small number of genes of at least moderate effect for those models to hold up and be stable. Right? If you have these huge number of gene loci that underlie, each with tiny effects on a trait dimension that underlie phenotypic variation, right? That's not an evolutionarily stable situation that can actually maintain personality variation over evolutionary time. So to the extent that the infinitesimal model is sort of correct in some way, it seems like more likely that what we're seeing are sort of pleiotropic side effects of polymorphism that's probably being maintained in the context of, say, pathogen-host coevolution, which explains a huge amount of the polymorphism in the genome and other things that just happen to have tiny little, effects on neurotransmitter systems and whatnot. I'm kind of getting into the weeds. I apologize.
Is on the phenotype, so
right.
And there could be different genetic inputs in different individuals, but you're still maintaining diversity across a broad range, not just any specific individual SNP or allele.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely true.
And yet there seem to be single gene polymorphisms that are functionally very important. The androgen receptor would seem to be a prime example of that. What's your take on that, given your perspective?
Well, it seems that these, however apparently functionally important, the replicability of these sorts of effects is very limited. And the field's gotten very excited a number of times about certain of these loci that appear to be very promising, and then eventually, a meta-analysis gets published and says, oh, no effect, actually, and also unknown file drawer problems. I guess at the end of the day, if our goal, my take would be, if our goal is to explain the variance in these phenotypic dimensions, then we should focus on the causes that actually explain the variance, and not fixate on genetic causes just because they're genes, when they actually explain a lot less of the variance in reliable ways. But yes, there could be. I actually, I assume they will find eventually some gene that reliably predicts phenotypes, even if it only explains a couple % of the variance. But I think the evidence right now is telling us that that's not the most important type of explanation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of room for discussion.
Sure. Yes.
Mine isn't a follow-up on this, or somebody else wanted to.
Go ahead.
Mine is a naive statistical question. You had that model of bargaining power predicting all of these other things. You did a mediation analysis or something like that? Or a path analysis?
Yeah, it's an structural equation model. It's a path model.
If you loaded one of the other ones in, if you swapped out, just took one of those ones over there and put it over here, would you get the same kinds of results if you tried that?
Not.
The reason I ask is if let's say I measured my arm length and leg length,
Mhm.
covary.
Right.
And then if I threw in torso length and controlled for variance in torso length, I would lose the covariance
Mhm.
between arms and legs. But I wouldn't say that one is somehow causing the others. I'd say that they're all sort of related. So I guess what I'm asking is if you just ran that same structural equation model 10 times each time using one of those outlying ones as your driver,
Right.
You would predict then that you'd only get the disappearance of the covariance when you put in bargaining power, but not the other.
Right. Well, you're right. It's a statistical necessity that you're going to get something like the same effect by taking any of the intercorrelated traits and controlling for it. And I've done those analyses. Nothing explains nearly as much of the overall covariation as bargaining power. And I actually included that analysis in the original manuscript, and they told me to take it out. But yeah, no, I didn't talk about it. That's why. But yeah, extraversion is the next competitor, and it explains about half of the variance that bargaining power does.
Both from kind of the psychological theory of bargaining power idea and from an anthropological perspective that suggests lots of variation in the way small-scale societies are organized and the kinds of ecologies that they exploit, you would expect that the specific details, with the possible exception of physical strength for men, the specific details might vary a lot as to what is driving personality characteristics in different social groups, right? So again, this is a potential liability of your reliance on Southern California undergraduates as your source of information, because physical strength matters not at all for women in terms of their bargaining power, and their physical attractiveness probably matters a great deal. But that's not going to be true for many, many small-scale societies where physical strength for women probably matters a lot. And things that you haven't measured, different skill sets, different knowledge bases, and so on, conceivably matter a lot. So in many small-scale societies, there is, as Brooke alluded to earlier, there's considerable division of labor and expertise, right? Even in what is sort of caricatured as a homogeneous band-level society, they're still experts, right? And pursuing expertise is an avenue for prestige and, as a consequence, bargaining power. Right? So you might expect that as you go from place to place, the particulars. In one model, a model that foregrounds bargaining power, the particulars will vary. In another model that says, there's some internal assessment of, early on, addressing Marty's point about developmental stability, about, how much do people's faces light up when they see me in my baby carriage, right? How easily am I able to lift things that people give me something?
Nobody has as much bargaining power as a baby in a baby carriage. But.
Right, but there's some internal assessment about how good am I, right? And it's not on the basis of social comparison. It's not who gets the fire truck at preschool when there's a disagreement. It's just internal assessment, right? if that's the case, then you wouldn't necessarily expect much variation. But that strikes me as a very implausible possibility.
Yeah.
So you know, that suggests again that you need to you need to expand the types of samples that you're using. And you alluded earlier to Mike Girvin's work, and you know, we were discussing earlier, we were both at HBS, and I remember nothing of it, so correct me if I'm wrong. But my memory is that one of the things that Mike has to say is that the 5-factor personality model doesn't hold in the Tsimane, right? So, I mean, one question starts to become, how much of this is really premised on, I mean, how easily can your model accommodate the collapse of, you know, Western personality psychology as being an ethnography and not a psychology?
I think it can. I'm not wedded at all to the 5-factor model or anything like it. I'm not sure that that's carving up the personality landscape in the most useful way. I just can't do everything all at once, or at least I haven't been able to. I think a theory of personality structure is a very important thing to do. That's derived from a priori logic. You know, but in terms of the underlying psychological mechanisms and outputs and everything else. But you know, I think that's more of a post-tenure project for me, unfortunately, given that you then have to enter the minefield of psychometrics, you know, and get shot down by a million psychometricians.
But you see where I'm going, which is that if it turns out that
oh yes, sorry, I forgot your question.
Okay, let me frame it.
I remembered it now.
Rather than a dramatic if it turns out that we're being recorded. If it turns out that 80–90% of personality psychology to date is really the personality psychology of weird people, and that is not human nature, right? Then the challenge stands. What is it? I mean, is this just purely, you know, a set of folk models, and folk models can influence development? Or from your perspective, it strikes me that that's an opportunity, because you can say, no. So what you have in Western societies that generates this stable configuration is a particular set of ecological niches and opportunities, right? So that the bargaining power mechanism channels people in ways that there is covariance.
Yes.
And when you're in different ecologies and different cultural environments, the same mechanism can produce different patterns of personality so that the covariation is different. And as a consequence, what appears to be, you know, an extremely parochial finding, that is, this is the psychology of weird people, is in fact just one data point that the theory can accommodate.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with you. And what I was going to get on to saying is that when it comes to Mike Girvin's data, what he finds, rather than the Big Five, is that pretty much all the traits in the Big Five taxonomy, or all the items, are intercorrelated very highly, right? And he finds two sort of higher order factors that appear to reflect the socioecology of the hunter horticultural existence of the Tsimane, right? There are basically two different social strategies you can pursue as a Tsimane. You can either be like a political type negotiator, you know, hobnobber, or you can be a hardworking sort of industrious person. And those are the two dimensions that he finds, right? You're either like a high status political type, or you're a, you know, hard nose to the grindstone industrious working person, right? But given that he finds, so here's what I would say. I think it's entirely possible that there's no sort of intrinsic personality structure that's intrinsically constrained. Fine. The common calibration theory would suggest that you'll get different patterns of covariation depending on the exact nature of the Q structure as it varies across societies and whatnot. But it's still possible that you would get Mike's findings if, again, like say the 5 factors, you know, internally with respect to the covariation among the facets, that reflects those reflect intrinsic interlinkages to some extent. So it sets, again, a lower bound on the extent to which certain subcomponents of traits can can be broken apart, right? But if you have you know, a common calibration situation where it's folding up the entire personality landscape into two highly you know, intercorrelated trait clusters, right? Then that's going to mask the underlying you know, potential existence of those intrinsic interlinkages that bundle up the lower order facets. that's a very abstract notion, but that's what I think the sort of most plausible interpretation is of that. And it's very interesting. The weirder you get in terms of your sample, the more factors you find, right? The hexaco and certain 7-factor models of personality that compete with the big 5 tend to be more exclusively focused on weird populations, whereas the big 5 appears to be more cross-culturally valid in the sense that it also describes certain more developing societies and whatnot. But then you get to horticulturalists, hunter-gatherers, and whatnot, and then you get like 1 or 2 factors where everything's highly intercorrelated because there's such a limited amount of sort of niches. So yeah, I think all of those are potential explanations and possibilities that provide a huge opening for anyone who wants to do that. I've brought it up to Mike, but it's a pretty big project to to get it going. Yes.
So putting aside for the moment Dan's question about the relationship between paper and pencil self-report, actual self-concept, and behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Putting that aside, very puzzled by the notion that people have accurate self-concept as reflected in self-report, given all of the behavioral economic stuff about like overbound effects. I mean, my understanding is for a wide variety of traits, the term for someone who perceives himself accurately is clinically depressed. The normal state is to overestimate your capacity. And this certainly fits with Dick White's studies of Harvard undergraduates, Harvard natural science undergraduates, where the reason that more men graduate than women is that the men are better able to conceal from themselves that they're at the bottom of the pecking order. So the notion that self-report is sort of automatically a good idea just strikes me as not consistent with lots of other data, but I don't know this field.
Well, there are 2 separate issues that you're kind of raising there. The first is the extent to which variation in self-report tracks variation in the actual, characteristic, let's say bargaining power, or attractiveness, or whatever. And then there's, in absolute terms, do people overestimate on scales? Right, and so yes, everyone overestimates, but the extent, yeah, you're right. Someone who says I'm only 4 out of 7, on a 7-point scale on self-esteem has low self-esteem, at least in the United States. But I mean, people, these results do demonstrate that. I mean, just pressing on a hydraulic device ends up explaining a huge portion of the variance in men's self-reported bargaining power. Not huge, but significant bundle of it. So. That's pretty compelling evidence that there's some non-arbitrary assessment of personal qualities, whether it's through social feedback cues or direct assessment. The reason that I don't think it's plausible, just briefly, that a bargaining power assessment mechanism operates entirely in a credulous way on the basis of social feedback is that people cannot be giving you the amount of valuation you can actually bargain for, right? Especially when it comes to formidability. Right, if you're formidable, you can be bargaining for more valuation from others than you're actually getting, right? So you can be undervalued, and you need to be able to know that discrepancy, right? I should get X amount of valuation from others, but I'm only getting this amount, so I need to bargain for more. But people often bring up the idea that the mechanism should just operate on social feedback, and that might be true for things like if you're good at generating benefits for others, then it's dependent on their valuation of those benefits and whatnot. But when it comes to formidability anyway, you should have a mechanism that's not entirely credulous.
It's been a fascinating discussion, which we unfortunately now have to bring to an end. Thank you very much.